going on in the news these days, and most of you have definitely heard about the IPCC and the series of reports on what the science says, and maybe you heard something about their grim assessments of the climate. But you might have also thought, this is not looking very fun to read. It's pretty dense science information. And for sure, those long reports have a bit of a marketing problem. Who wants to read the exciting, uplifting story about our narrowing window of opportunity to save the burning world? Well, when we take a closer look today, we'll see that the story is action-packed with collapsing ice sheets and melting permafrost. We'll also see the tiny slivers of good news around some of the technologies and approaches that can make a difference. Unfortunately, we're also going to see how Canada really needs to do a lot if we're going to stay caught up with our responsibilities to eliminate our own emissions. To cut to the chase on that point, the measures in Canada's 2030 emissions reductions plan announcements are a feeble window dressing compared to the substantial transformations that are really required. I'm Paul Burns, and this is Climate Action Matters. This is a fact-based channel about climate change and Canada's transition from fossil fuels. Since we're in the business of getting good information on climate and pointing to good ways of getting involved, we're going to really need to know what's in the IPCC reports. So let's find out. Let's find out who these people are, how the reporting works, some of the highlights, and what we as ordinary people in Canada should be paying attention to. What is the IPCC? The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's the United Nations body for assessing climate change. It is the official science. The IPCC was created in 1988 by the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization. The purpose of their work is to tell us what the science agrees on about climate change. They basically have the job of going through the latest good information and explaining what it says. Scientists from 195 member countries contribute content. Hundreds of studies are assessed. The extent of agreement amongst the scientists is noted, and the summaries are pulled together. I had to think about this for a minute, a good second. It's only been in the past decades that there was this ability for the scientific community to work across that many jurisdictions and across languages with such an amount of depth and variety in the information. In the end, the IPCC reports give us the highest quality, most thorough expert analysis on the state of science on climate change that has ever existed. This is a significant development. It's big stuff. The reports note where there are new findings and where further study is needed. This needs a little bit of comment. The scale of the science is massive. And also, some of the science is relatively new given the new tools and technologies that come up all the time. So following conventions in research, the IPCC reports will note where further research would help. There are some good examples of this, actually. A couple of cycles back, the IPCC mentioned methane in the permafrost, for example, as an area to look at. And then they did just that in subsequent reports. Another example is how they consider emerging technologies like carbon sequestration. I've seen some commentary that confuse the new findings and further research notes with scientific uncertainty. But let's be careful on this point. In case there are naysayers, there are not changes in the findings. These are advances in the science. Let's look at who's involved in the IPCC reports and look at how they do their work. The IPCC organization sends a call to governments for nominations, and detailed resumes are collected. Team members are selected based on their expertise, technical and geographic backgrounds, and these selected scientists then volunteer to review summaries of the latest scientific information on climate. This includes dozens of Canadian scientists. There were actually 28 Canadians contributing in the last cycle of the reports. So overall, there were hundreds of scientists around the world involved in the recent round of IPCC work. The IPCC work is structured into numbered assessment reports and associated working group reports. They have also some other special reports. We can use the terms AR and WG for short. The IPCC prepares the AR reports on the knowledge on climate change, its causes, potential impacts, and response options. There are 3 working groups. Working group number 1 deals with the physical science basis of climate change. Working group number 2 deals with climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Working group number 3 deals with mitigation of climate change. And this is quite a large and unusual collaboration that's been going on for a number of years. The reports build on prior reports, so we can see that the certainty and the consensus continues to improve. The result is an internationally recognized consensus summary of the state of science on climate change, prepared by the world's leading experts. So let's talk about the 6th assessment report, which we will call AR6. This year, 2022, is a big year for the IPCC reporting. AR6 involves the work of 743 experts. The 3 working group reports for AR6 are now published and available on the IPCC website. I'll put the links in the description. For starters, it's not the case that these reports are all doom and gloom. It's just that they're mostly doom and gloom, but with little flecks of optimistic findings scattered about. AR6 has 18 chapters, and together there are thousands of pages. At first blush, it sounds like that's something only specialists would read, but each of the working group reports have shorter format summaries for policymakers. These are a manageable read. And in this story, we are the policymakers. The summaries include, broadly speaking, a high-level note on the science and approach for the report, and key findings statements, along with notes about the extent of agreement on those statements, sometimes called confidence levels. Also, different scenarios or pathways are laid out and put against a number of outcomes. This is a way of describing the different projections. So, for example, in a scenario where we continue to have lots of CO2 emissions, what does the science tell us it would do for storm intensity or sea level rise? The scientists review the available research and make projections and then agree on it in the report. Let's take a look at some of the highlights from AR6 WG1. The Working Group Report 1, Contribution to the AR6 report, addresses the most up-to-date physical understanding of the climate system and climate change. There are dozens of findings in the report. Today we'll highlight just 3. Finding A1, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. Finding number A3. Human-induced climate change is already affecting every inhabited region across the globe, with human influence contributing to many observed changes in weather and climate extremes. Finding B1. Global surface temperatures will continue to increase until at least mid-century, under all emission scenarios. Consider this. Global warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. You'll see in this graph the detail around the relationship between CO2 emissions and global temperatures. We know that there's high agreement amongst scientists that human influence has warmed the climate at a faster rate than any time in the last 2,000 years. This next graphic takes into account some of the modeling developed in earlier reports. Essentially, they put together 5 illustrative scenarios that cover the range of possible futures based on the research. The scenarios with higher emissions will have different impacts on global weather conditions. The scientists all agree the more CO2, the worse things get. So the faster we can get to net zero or negative emissions, the better things would be for our kids and their kids. On this view, it is pretty grim. You can see the play of negative feedback loops. It shows that with the scenarios associated with higher emissions, there's a decreasing ability for natural carbon sinks to absorb CO2. So with more CO2 staying in the atmosphere, the weather gets worse, and then a lot worse. So it's not just a linear, but it's a curvilinear relationship. Let's take a quick look at the AR6WG2 report. The Working Group 2 contribution to the AR6 assessed the impacts of climate change, looking at ecosystems, biodiversity, and human communities at a global and regional level. They reviewed vulnerabilities and the capacities of the natural world and society to adapt. There's a couple of highlights to share. Finding B5, climate change impacts and risks are becoming increasingly complex and more difficult to manage. There are multiple hazards compounding overall risk across sectors. They have this as a high confidence finding. But you know what? There's some good news. There are a group of findings that show some positive things. For example, SPMC1 says the progress in adaptation, planning, and implementation has been observed across all sectors and regions, generating multiple benefits. And these comments refer to the whole world, and it with high confidence. So that's really good news. But they do mention that the progress is uneven and there's too much focus on near-term solutions instead of long-term transformation. Finding C2 says there are feasible and effective adaptation options which can reduce risks to people and nature. And they add that the feasibility of these differs across sectors and regions. They also say that the effectiveness of the strategies will decrease as the weather changes. This is good news though, because as usual with climate change, there's always drama and urgency. That's always still with us. You can see in the chart that they explain there's a narrowing window of opportunity for us to respond. Let's take a look at this latest one released in April 2022. That's AR6WG3 Mitigation of Climate Change. There's a couple of good highlights to share with you in this report. One of the findings, that's C3, says all global modeling pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no limited overshoot, and those that limit warming to 2 degrees involve rapid and deep, and in most cases immediate, greenhouse gas emissions reductions in all sectors. They go on to explain that this involves deep and immediate investments in non-CO2 energy sources, which are currently available. There's a particular consideration for Canada because the government's emission reduction plan does not include timelines for the closure of oil and gas production, for example. Other findings in this report take it further. That's C4. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the full energy sector requires major transitions, including substantial reduction in the overall fossil fuel use and the deployment of low emissions energy sources, switching to alternative energy carriers, and energy efficiency and conservation. Here at home, us ordinary Canadians will have to get good at expecting these kind of directions from our federal and provincial leaders as they develop those future ambitions for the emissions reduction plan. The little dose of good news in this area is that many options are now available in all sectors to reduce the use of fossil fuels. The bad news is that Canada is absolutely not keeping up on this most important part. And there's this really good chart for assessing bang for buck. There's a list of mitigation options here, and you'll see there's a line beside each that shows how much of a greenhouse gas reduction impact there is for each. The longer the line, the more benefit. You'll see by the color that the more red something is, the more expensive it is. The very large problem for Canada is that there's so much attention to a couple of the items on this list that do not offer good bang for buck. So any criticism you ever hear about the government's plan for emissions reduction by investing in carbon sequestration, for example, is well-founded. There's so much more to gain, according to these charts, by paying attention to wind and solar. And even with working with agriculture and forestry, although expensive, those offer more positive impacts for the climate. There is a last section here on strengthening the responses. There are findings on how well we manage mitigation, and this turns up the heat on speed and scale. Finding E1 says that there are mitigation options which are feasible to deploy at scale in the near term. That's great news. Feasibility differs across sectors and regions, and it differs according to capacities. Barriers to feasibility would need to be reduced or removed, and enabling conditions put in place. So what do these reports prove? The reports prove that there is tight scientific consensus on hundreds of alarming points about impacts of global warming. And there's a huge amount of technical and policy actions that governments can take to address global warming and achieve the best outcomes. This is the science analysis. Far-reaching, dramatic, urgent, but it's not the whole story for us. A look at the findings also shows that Canada is not yet doing its part. Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan includes some investments in EVs, home energy costs, and it does not include a timeline for the elimination of oil and gas production, our worst area. The rest is up to us to pay attention to. We have to use the information and pressure our media to tell the stories and pressure our governments to implement the right directions. I wish the reports were way more explicit on this one point, that we are the policymakers. And in our case, the future ambitions related to Canada's climate mitigation are still under development. The IPCC reports are serious reports, and they point to a lot of work that has to get done. The findings reasonably point to the fact that Canada is not yet doing enough. So therefore, read them. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about it like it's a big deal. Help make it normal to talk about climate change with good information. As usual, the footnotes and links are all below, and I'll see you next time on Climate Action Matters.